Good afternoon. I am Laura. I'm Laura Miller. I'm a training and consultation coordinator at the Allegheny Intermediate Unit 3, joined by my colleague.
Yes. And I'm Jacob Minsinger. I am also a training and consultation coordinator at Allegheny Intermediate Unit 3. For the purposes of this presentation, you're going to hear a little bit about the different perspectives because Laura and I have worked together much longer than my tenure at the IU, which started in August. Before that, I was an assistant principal. So some of what I'm going to be talking about is from the lens of being a former assistant principal at a 7th and 8th grade middle school, trying to figure out as we received students who struggled to read proficiently, what did we do with them and how did we build that system? And Laura and I worked together on that when we were in those different capacities, and now we work much closer together.
That's correct. We're both also recovering English teachers by trade. So
Also
I was a
true.
high school and middle school
Yep.
ELA teacher for many years before moving into school administration and then to the IU position, and same with Jacob.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. So our goals for today are to talk about several things related to secondary literacy interventions. First being to understand and identify the primary barriers as we've seen them from both sides of the school spectrum, being at the IU and being embedded in schools. We'll also be talking about the idea of how we can start to map interventions at the secondary level to provide clarity, as we heard earlier. As a part of that process, we're going to define and talk about how we define criteria for entry into an intervention, how we monitor that progress as a student is going through an intervention at the secondary level, and very importantly, how we also exit a student from an intervention. And we'll talk about the reasons for that. And then we also have some resources we will provide for you. They are linked. I'll go back here. If you didn't see the bit.ly on the first slide, I'll leave this up for a second to type that in. Also on the Patent site, events.patent.net, you have access to this presentation as well as a zipped participant folder that has downloadable versions of the examples and the templates we're going to show you today. But if you want to, if getting on the Patent site has been tricky, that's a bit.ly that can take you straight to it. And those are kind of our goals for today, are really to establish some of our common understandings around the challenges of secondary literacy interventions and how we can begin to start to support our students and think about how we can structure our schools and our systems at the secondary level to make this happen, which is often the biggest challenge that we face, and we'll enumerate on some of those barriers that we have encountered throughout our journey together.
Absolutely. So let's begin by setting the stage. Let's talk about the challenges of intervening at the secondary level. You know, there are lots of them, right? We often hear time in the schedule is a problem, right? It is different at the elementary level where classes tend to be more self-contained and we can create time more easily. When we get into the confines of the master schedule at the secondary level, it can be very difficult. When we get to the high school level, of course, we're talking about things like credits and making sure that students get everything that they need towards graduation. So we know the struggle of that. We have both been responsible for the creation of a secondary master schedule before, and we understand really how difficult it can be to fit in the intervention time. We also know that there is a lack of reading specialists and/or dedicated personnel at the secondary level. Sometimes we work with schools where there is no one. Sometimes it's one person for 800 students, right? And so really thinking about how we maximize and get our best outcomes out of secondary intervention is a whole different ballgame than at the elementary level. We know as secondary teachers by trade that we were not trained to be teachers of reading, right? So I had no classes in how students learn to read as part of my educational process. And I know that at least to become a secondary English teacher, right? I have since, but we know that that is a fairly common experience for teachers. We are teachers of content primarily. And though a lot of folks feel it falls to the ELA teacher, we are not trained to do so.
And I think extending off of that, not only are we thinking about just our teachers who are not trained in that avenue, but we also think about our school leaders who have a component. As we talk about, you can't talk about secondary interventions without talking about a schedule somewhere, right? And so having common understandings among school leadership in terms of building and central office administrators is a key part of that. Another thing I would say with the third bullet point here that I think is a particular thing to watch out for is that we also, as we're working with teachers and our colleagues, both as teachers and at the administrative level, is that while we can acknowledge, and probably many of us in this room will acknowledge that this third bullet point is true, not everybody feels that way, right? So there are lots of people who are like, what do you mean? I do know how to teach reading and I do it this way. And then they tell you about the workshop styles that they use and other things that perhaps are not going to get the best outcomes for kids. And so knowing that, that's one of the ways that when we work together on this, had to approach that work is to talk about surfacing misconceptions and how we can start to break some of those down to form common evidence-based understanding.
Absolutely. We also know that there are a lack of appropriate resources. There are not tons of secondary literacy intervention programs on the market. Those that do exist often are not in schools. And so we know that it's a very different landscape than we see at the elementary level, where there is a plethora of resources that exist. There are very few at the secondary level. And then we know that by the time a student becomes an adolescent struggling reader, they typically are not struggling in one strand of reading, right? They're struggling in multiple, if not all, of the strands of reading. Because it's compacted over time. It is very different than a kindergartner who needs some work in one strand, and maybe once we are able to work with that student, they are fine to return to tier 1 with no support. That is not the case for adolescent struggling readers. Typically, again, we see multiple, if not all, of the strands being places where the students struggle.
And usually it's not even just reserved for reading. Right? At the secondary level, when we're starting to identify, or as we often talked when we were having student problem solving meetings with MTSS and trying to untangle the rope of like, where should we start with an intervention? It was very messy to start with. Is it because the child did not have a good solid reading foundation that now they're seeing reading deficits? Or is it because of some of the things that were mentioned in earlier presentations around executive functioning, anxiety, and some of those other skills that compound themselves at the secondary level to a very kind of messy process, right? And so, bless you, that's one of the things that we consider, and we'll talk a little bit about throughout this presentation, of how to sort of tease out and how our behavior-minded friends can also help us with this process.
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk next about my experience as a consultant just a little bit. I often get called in and folks will say, help us with tier 3, right? And then we start to talk about how many students are in tier 3, 54%, right? We don't want to talk about tier 1. Tier 1 is fine. We've always been fine. We just want to talk about tier 3. Well, over time, things have shifted. We have had obviously a worldwide pandemic, student populations change, and tier 3 can sometimes be half of your student population, if not more. It's very difficult to get schools to focus in on that, though, because they want the fix for intervention. They don't want to talk about what's happening at tier 1. A favorite is we need support in reading comprehension. And then we start to untangle that, as Jacob said. And we say, well, the kids can't decode. And they're like, yes, but we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about reading comprehension, right? And we have spent the day hearing about the complex nature of reading comprehension. We know that that is the outcome of having all of the other pieces in place. And so again, that needing to build that knowledge and work on misconceptions is prevalent at the secondary level. And then my favorite, what can we use for 15 minutes, 2 times a week, every other week, and get results, right? And so that is a very common, because of the scheduling issue and the lack of personnel, and sometimes the large number of students requiring help, we say we want to help everyone. So the best we can do is split the period into 3 different time slots, and I'm going to get them on A days only, right? And We know that that is not an effective model. And in thinking of that, it just really isn't a way to get results for students. And so we did a lot of talking when Jacob was the administrator and I was the consultant about how can we increase everyone's knowledge at the table of what it's going to take to get outcomes from students, depending on where their skill gaps were and what programs and strategies we had available for them.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about your experience
Yes,
from
and
the.
I would just like to point out, none of these are quotes from me as a former assistant principal who was working with a lovely
Right, I'll tell you
consultant.
which one's after.
That's
Just kidding.
yeah, that's 4 and 5 on this list. So from the administrator perspective, these are some of the things that we were looking at as people in schools every day working with students who were coming to us struggling. We knew that some kids needed more than just what they were getting in their 45 or 84-minute, depending on, for us, our grade level, amount of time in Tier 1, right? So sort of like Laura was saying, we recognized that we needed something else, knowing also that we needed to shore up things at the Tier 1 level. Because as Dr. Vaughn talked about this morning, there's a lot that can be done with aligning what we do with all kids at the Tier 1 level with how we add on additional supports and specific strategy work. The other thing, and this kind of dovetails off of what Laura was saying around that second bullet point of we need help with reading comprehension. I will say, though I don't think I said that, there are times, and any of us who have worked in schools know, when we get our PVOS scores back and when we get our like e-metric data back and we look at that and we say we need help with the red, right? So we know that there is the reality of that kind of knee-jerk reaction to say, we see this deficit area, please help somebody. Knowing as we go through this and work together, it's a more complex web to tangle through. But in particular, this second bullet point is referring to PVOS and thinking about how we can use existing data sets to start to identify where we need to support our kids. And in my case, at the building I was at, our first and second quintiles of kids who were performing at the lowest levels in the state were showing the least amount of growth compared to kids who were performing already at proficient and advanced levels. And so that was a flag for us at the school level to say, we need to do something differently. Again, that answer is partially in how we do Tier 1, but it was also, we recognized that we were not addressing gaps in instruction that had led to gaps over time with our students. My personal favorite one is shiny object syndrome, which is my, I'm detoxing from this syndrome now, I would say, which is that, as Laura said earlier, if you're in secondary literacy and you love that world, there are very few things that like are robust enough and that have a lot of meat to them that make you think, yes, I want to go for that. So if you see one of them, I tended to jump at it, right? Because it felt good to say like, oh, there's a program that can actually help us systematically address vocabulary, comprehension, fluency, and everything all in one. And it felt great, right? And then a new one would come along and I'd be like, well, we need to use this one too, because there are some kids who need this. And when we started to do that, you feel the strain on the system of a school, because as I'm talking about this, if you're in a teaching role, you're probably like, oh my God, this principal is going to throw 3 interventions at me to teach, right? And so we have to think about how we can strategically add interventions without just adding one thing this year, using it until we saw data that didn't show good results, and then we ditched it, found something else, tried that for a couple months, and then ditched it until we found something else that worked, instead of taking a pause and looking at our system and doing some reflection on how that has worked.
And if I can just add to that,
yeah.
Part of my job as the consultant was to talk often with Jacob and his team about what data should we be looking at.
Right.
Because we implemented something and PSSA scores didn't go through the roof does not mean the intervention didn't work, right? When we think to the strand, and that goes back to what you said earlier about the need to pinpoint what are we going to be using to progress monitor students when they are involved in these interventions.
Right, right. And then the last big bullet point here is one that I think is as we've said, is sort of a constant battle point for secondary schools, which is the scheduling implications. So when we do start to come up with robust advanced tier options at the Tier 2 and 3 level, how do we get them to kids, balancing the various electives and credits that they have to graduate because they need PE and they need so many science and so many elective credits and so on, right? For me at the middle school, we weren't dealing with credits as much, but we were dealing with a finite amount of time. And I will also say, just as a sidebar from this, we were also dealing, in my case, with a community that did not feel great about taking kids out of specials, for example, right, to get reading intervention. They had a reaction to that. They felt like their kids should be in all of the encore special area classes just as much as they should be in the core classes, which was great. And that's a wonderful idea. But then the question becomes, so then where do they get this support, right? If we want them in everything and we want them in something else, how do we do that within a day that is not getting any longer for students, right? And so these were things that sort of set the stage for us to think about tools that we could use to start to really wrap our heads around the best ways to implement intervention support at the middle and high school level. So what we started to do is come up with really 3 types of organizational tools that actually we borrow from existing tools that have gone on and been in existence in the behavior world for some time, and we'll look at examples of what these are. But so the first one is we wanted to put together a skill grid, because one of the things, as Laura and I have said, is that we wanted to dispel some of the misconceptions about what it actually meant to intervene with a kid, right? So at the tier 2 and tier 3 level, we weren't looking necessarily at intervening on a specific eligible content or standard, right? And so what we did is we first started by creating a skill grid that mapped out for both us as the administrator, the consultant, and our teacher team, what are the skills that we actually need to target intervention for, which we then built on when we built out an intervention grid that basically mapped out for us how we're going to decide who goes into these interventions that we had mapped to skills. And so those 2 tools, again, we're going to show you some examples of them, go together. But the first part of this is really identifying what are the skills that we need to support students in, and what intervention resources do we have at our disposal, and do we have gaps in those? And then once we sort through that, we develop some criteria for when to identify a student for an intervention, so that there's some commonality and common language across our school in how we actually implement that intervention, who goes into it, and when they exit from it. The last one that we're going to talk briefly about, and we'll show you an example of, is an academic tracking tool, which is really, once you have the first 2 documents of these put together, it's a way for you and your school team to monitor progress on a system level. So oftentimes in interventions, we think about an individual kid making progress, right? So if I have an intervention, the Wilson reading system, for example, right? When we look at the Wilson reading system, usually we are thinking about how Jacob is doing in the Wilson reading system from step to step to step. And those of you who know Wilson know what I'm talking about when I literally say step by step by step, right? What we don't often do as a school is take a step back to say how, not only is how Jacob's doing, but how is Laura doing in that intervention too? And when we look all together, we want to track to see what percentage of our students are actually showing progress and growth in that intervention. Because if we just look at individual kids, we sometimes miss the big picture of saying, none of the kids are making progress in this intervention. We need to hold the phone and say, perhaps it's not a problem with the student or an individual case, but it's a problem with how we're implementing with fidelity, maybe how we're allocating time in a student's day or in our schedule to actually use that intervention. And so this tracking tool that we'll show you has an easy way to keep track of that and spur conversation around looking at the actual intervention health, is sort of how I describe it, versus like, is an individual student making progress, which is important, but it's not the complete picture in a lot of cases when we're talking about our intervention.
If I could just say, we're going to focus most of our time on the first 2 pieces. You have
Yeah.
to have those in place today. We feel very confident that if you get those pieces in place anybody who is trained in advanced tiers and behavior, or someone at your IU or patent consultants who are behavior team can walk you through the tracking tool, because again, we borrowed it from the behavior world and how we look at those pieces. But I can tell you, as a consultant to many schools, right, I've used this with schools to identify this is not an issue with the intervention, it's an issue with the schedule.
Right.
And how often we're giving these students the intervention, right? If we're giving it to them 4 times a week, they're making growth. If we're giving it 2 times a week, they are not. So it does allow us to look at different situations and judge not individual students, but the health of the entire system.
Yeah, it prevents those knee-jerk reactions of saying, Wilson isn't working, let's get rid of it, right? Instead of
object syndrome.
It's the shine, yes, it's the and in that case, that object had no longer been shiny.
Dull.
Right, it had dulled a little bit, but it gives us a process to take a step back and really evaluate multiple components. So when we think about our intervention grid, we are talking about using a document that grounds our team in decision making. And in particular, what we're looking at is creating, it's sort of like a little dictionary or glossary for each of our interventions that allows us to identify and really process through what is our purpose in actually using that intervention and how kids will actually become qualified for that. Because one of the things that we experienced was that, again, because there were not a ton of intervention options, we, a couple years ago, were in the place of like, we had one intervention, and if you struggled to read, that's where you went, right? It didn't matter if you had a specific deficit in the area the intervention was designed for. It just happened to be there because it was the only one that we had, and there you go, right? This document helped us to start to map out how to parse the differences between interventions and to help us realize that we had some gaps in the intervention options that we did or did not have. And it also, I like to say this document slows down the process a little bit. Instead of us getting straight to the shiny object syndrome all the time, this really helps us start to methodically think through what actually is used, what actually will this intervention be used for, and how are we going to implement it across our school instead of just handing it to somebody and saying, have at it, right? Which we know is a recipe for disaster.
So we started to think a little bit about the critical features of the interventions. And so we just want to take a step back and say, when we work with schools now on creating these documents and tools, oftentimes they want to add everything, every resource they have to the intervention grid in terms of something that they can give for student support. And we would caution against that. We sometimes have districts that come back and it's 3 pages long. And we're like, you do not have that many secondary literacy intervention programs, right? So we can have resources that are not interventions, and we need to be very clear about that distinction. And so when we are talking about interventions, we want them to have these following like critical features. We want them to be evidence-based. We want them to be targeted towards specific literacy skills or targeted as a comprehensive, right? If it's to include everything. We want to be able to have continuous monitoring of that intervention using database decision-making. So we want there to be something that we can see as a result to progress monitor on. If we cannot find what that is when we're creating the intervention grid, it has to get scratched. It cannot be a part of the intervention grid if we cannot use data to be monitoring students' growth in that. And then, as always with adolescent readers, our adolescent struggling readers, we want it to be developmentally appropriate for the grade level and to hold their dignity. We know that there are some programs that would work with our adolescent readers, but they don't hold the dignity of an adolescent reader. And so we are careful about trying to be very selective about the ones that we feel do, and that we hear, from teachers and from students hold their dignity, so that we can be sure that we are not producing more of the anxiety that we heard about this morning, right, from Dr. Vaughn.
Right. And kids will tell you, anybody who works at a
Absolutely.
secondary school will tell you when you're doing a secondary intervention with them, which ones are engaging and which ones that they have all sorts of names for that they will describe and tell you about.
Absolutely. So we began with the grid. So let's get into the tools. Okay, so we talked about our guiding question was, what strand of reading is a barrier for this student or for our students? And so the first time we sat down to write one of these, we thought about, of course, the big 5, right? And we said, is this where we think adolescent readers struggle? And we stopped and we reflected on our own time as ELA instructors, right? And as administrators. And we said, typically, no, right? It's a little bit more than that. We don't often get a secondary student whose only struggle is in phonology, right? We may get a student whose struggle is in phonics, but we felt the need to differentiate between basic phonics and advanced phonics. Sometimes we have students who were successful before we got to that multisyllabic word level, right? And so we wanted to pull those apart and say that something that addresses an advanced phonics deficit may not be enough for a student who also has a basic phonics need. We thought about fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and then we said there are some kids who need it all, right? And so those would be our comprehensive. We, in the case of this school, colored it yellow because we just really wanted to think critically about that. We know that comprehensive reading intervention is time and personnel consuming, right? That's a big commitment. And so we wanted to be careful to only put students who really needed a comprehensive into a comprehensive. If you only needed multisyllabic word reading or you only needed some work around comprehension, we didn't want to misplace you and frustrate you and take a spot from a student who might need it and, right? We wanted to get you the targeted help that you needed. We borrow this from the behavior world. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so if your school has done PBIS work over the years and has trained in advanced tiers work, this skill grid is similar to a function grid that we would do about the function of a kid's behavior and matching interventions to that function. I see some head nods. If you don't know what that means, that's okay. There's an example of one in the slide or in the PowerPoint materials. But this really comes from as we start to map out interventions behaviorally and we think about things like check-in, check-out, or social groups and things like that. We want to match a kid's function, so the reason why they do their behavior, to whatever that intervention is. So if a kid is seeking adult attention, we would want to match the intervention that we give them to something that aligns with adult attention. Versus if we have a kid who wants to avoid adult attention, we don't want to give them an intervention that gives them tons of adult attention. They will not like it. Right? The same thing is true on the academic side in terms of how we think about motivation. And if we are not targeting the right skill, and that sometimes is the danger when we put kids in comprehensive interventions, when really all they need is help in vocabulary, for example. If that's the case, you end up disincentivizing that kid from wanting to engage in that intervention because they think it's too easy, right? And we've heard this you hear this all the time from secondary students. I've done this for the past 5 years. I already know this, right? Sometimes that is a front, obviously, but sometimes that is true. And if we don't have good data to help us determine these specific strands, we fall into that trap of sometimes over-intervening, especially when we think about that comprehensive level, because a lot of you, if you think about comprehensive, or probably if we go back to the scheduling question, thinking about how intensive that time is to give that to a student and what they then must miss in order to get that comprehensive intervention. When, if we dig into it, if they only needed vocabulary support, they could get that in a different form throughout the day than what that intensive comprehensive intervention might look like.
I just want to say this is not the be all end all. Every school looks a little different, right? So we have schools that add writing to this. We have schools that add morphology to this. We have schools who combine the basic and advanced because they don't have something to separately address those things, right? And so when you're thinking about where does the data suggest your students struggle, or where does your experience, where's a good place to start thinking about this, this is the first step to say, these are the areas in which we are going to offer intervention. And as Jacob said, it can't be a one size fits all. Everyone in reading intervention does not get the same program. How does that work out with the schedule? That becomes a conversation with the administration to figure out. Again, we acknowledge that barrier exists.
Yep.
So we begin with a resource inventory. And we want to just think about what interventions are currently being used. Letter B is a big one. What do we have in our district that is not currently being used? When we engage in this process with schools, we find the best stuff at the back of the filing cabinets, in the back of the cupboard.
We clean the cupboards out in this process. That's
Yes,
usually what happens.
Really, we take time. We ask everyone who might know, right? There's someone with institutional knowledge. This was not the same process, but years ago when I was working as a consultant, we found out by including one other person in the conversation that we had 6 copies of the intervention we were looking for in the back of someone's closet, right? And they hadn't been used in years, but we had them, and that was a cost savings of about $7,500. So we start by cleaning out the closet. Someone's ordered something at some point, and we want to know what we have.
Shiny
right?
object syndrome at its finest, ladies.
Right. So what we're using, but also what we're not using. What
Yeah.
what has dulled in our eyes and we've moved on from.
Yeah.
We also want to think about the fidelity of the implementation. Is it something that can be taught 2 days a week? Is it something that requires 5 days a week? And then what interventions are systematized, right? What do we know? What do we have? What are we using? We just want to begin by jotting those things down. Then we want to think about what is each intervention used for? And if we don't know, a great place to start, you can go to the What Works Clearinghouse, you can go to NCII, right? Or you can go to the publisher's website and see what is this intervention even trying to address? Sometimes with good intention, we are mismatching what the student needs to the intervention. It doesn't even address that strand, right? And so it's all we have, it's the spot we have. So we offer it to students, but as Jacob said, that disincentivizes students to participate, and obviously can cause all sorts of problems for students when we are asking them to engage in the wrong kind of intervention.
Right. Dovetailing off of this, going back to an earlier point about wanting to make sure we clear up misconceptions with our colleagues who we work with, this process is best done with a team of people at your school, right? It is not a great idea to do this with your trusted TAC consultant and your school administrator alone, right? We have to engage the different voices of those who have institutional knowledge of what our school has done over the past several years, right? We want to engage our whatever specialists. In some schools, that's a reading specialist, or like Laura said, some schools it's not, and sometimes it falls on special education teachers and case managers, right? Whoever those people are that are delivering the intervention, you want to have a part of this resource inventory team. I would also heavily suggest that you also have general education representatives or a department chair of some kind, if that's how your school might be structured, who sits and has some component of literacy as a part of their job and their world, because while they may not be delivering these things, they are crucial in showing, again, the connection between tier 1 and our advanced tier work. And so having those key people around the table is going to be important in order for you to get a comprehensive view and to start building your colleagues' knowledge around what this should look like, right? So I always say, don't be afraid to invite the people who maybe don't quite know this yet. They can learn through this process because of the usefulness of the tools that you'll see through the skill grid.
So here's an example. Here's the first one. And I want to begin by saying it didn't start this way, right? This school did not own all of these intervention programs. The school that we worked with, this was actually not Jacob's school. This is a different school that we did this process with. But they owned 2. They owned 2 of these, right? And so we said, okay, I believe it was read to achieve and reward. So we said what we can address is some vocabulary and comprehension. By the way, this we found in the back closet. It had never been opened, right? It had been ordered by somebody who then got moved to another position, and it had never been opened. Read to achieve is a great comprehension intervention to use with students. So we found that in the back closet. It wasn't being used, and we had rewards, which we know is a phenomenal product for multisyllabic word reading and increases students' fluency, and that's all we had. And so we worked our way systematically through this and said, okay, so what if a student only needed vocabulary? What if a student only needed work in fluency? What if a student only needed work in multisyllabic words? And we just thought about this process and worked through it. So one thing RIU has that was a benefit to our districts is we have a lending library full of interventions that we allow schools to borrow and try. And so through this process, our schools borrow things that fill the gaps, they try them out, and then they determine whether or not that's the right fit for their school. Highly suggest you call publishers and ask for samples. If you don't have a IU lending library, borrow from someone else. Ask your other buildings. Sometimes these things are sitting in other buildings unused, right, by other specialists. So really, that inventory process is really, really important. It makes a lot of sense from an administrative standpoint to hear we need to buy something that fills this gap because this is the gap that we have, right? After we've inventoried everything and looked through this process, not just shiny object syndrome, but rather this grid doesn't look like this grid anymore. I think we now have vocab surge on it, right? So for a vocabulary specific intervention and a few other things. And so we really want to think about what addresses what. And a student who needs comprehension work should not go into the parallel universe. That is ill-fitting, right? And this just allows us to think really critically about it. On the flip side, if a student doesn't have a deficit in any of these areas, they don't belong in reading intervention, right? And so that happens often at the secondary level as well. We become the grounds for, well, they're not passing the class.
Or
Like,
Laura, they got basic on the PSSAs.
What's that?
Laura, they got basic on the PSSAs. Where do I
Right.
put them? Right. Things
But
like
if we
that.
don't have a skill gap here, that is not the issue, right? As Jacob said, it is often a tangled web, and we have to untangle that. But reading intervention cannot be the place where we put students who don't engage in their homework, right? That's not, we don't have an intervention on our grid to address that. That maybe goes over to the behavior team. Maybe that becomes a tier 1+ support, right? But we are not taking students in just because they have an F in English if there is not a reading deficit. Now, we could expand this into writing and so on and so forth as we address the needs and have less and less students falling into these areas, but it allows us to prioritize. And what I hear all the time from my colleagues at the secondary level who are reading specialists or interventionists is every kid who has a struggle in anything is recommended to come to my class, right? And so then they end up with 28 students, some of whom don't have reading difficulty. And so we really want to be very strategic and say, if they don't fall in one of these, then they don't get reading intervention. They could get another intervention, but not reading intervention.
And they may, again, need different types of support. And I love, again, what Dr. Vaughn said earlier about connecting tier 1 and tier 2, right? So perhaps that kid may not need something as structured and systematic and explicit as this, but they may need a targeted set of reteaching, pre-teaching, and smaller, higher dosages in a smaller setting to get some of those skills that lead the principal and me to say, but what do I do with my kids who are basic and below basic, right? Because we live and we talk to teachers and teams about this in these sort of parallel tracks that we have to walk at the secondary level, which is the track of like, where do they fit on the continuum of skills that are up here, which is one sort of track of support we need to offer. But then where do we also fit the support for the kids who need grade level remediation because they are not performing at grade level according to the standards that are set out, right? Those standards are not necessarily all of these components, right? And so we work with schools to think through that.
I'll add that, yes, we added vocabulary in on this one, right? We added some pieces there. We wanted to talk about that. I'll add that another district, so I said this one started with not very many. Another district I'm working with, and if they're listening, they'll love this shout out, right? We did an inventory K-8. It's a big district of all the interventions they had amongst their like title teachers, interventionists, special education. The answer was 112 different things. Right. And so it's almost like analysis paralysis or whatever. There's just too many options. 112 that ranged from really evidence-based practices to like box of sight words is what I'm using. Right. And so this huge array of what we were considering intervention, this allowed us to focus in and think very strategically. A student in our district, right? What do they get if this is their deficit? And obviously this can be done at the elementary level as well, but we're talking about it from a secondary level.
Right.
Go ahead.
So this is another example of a skill grid. This is the one that was done at the school that I formerly worked at, where we started with, again, a couple of these interventions and built out from there. One of the things as you're getting copies of both the skill grid and the intervention grid from our two examples that I will tell you is that when I look at this and when we were putting this together, one of the things that is still an ongoing question that we grapple with in our schools is the scheduling of how we do each of these things, right? So some of this, again, this grid, when we started this process, had 2 rows to it. So it felt way more manageable than now having this to it. Because what we found is that we were doing 2 very comprehensive interventions, but did not have the agility in our schedule or with our staff to target more specific finite interventions that do not take, I will say one intervention took 6 years to get through.
Yeah.
So we had to adjust our thinking. So while there are more on this than where we started, the interventions that are on here do not all take multi-years to get through, right? And so that was a component that as we got to the intervention grid process that helped us, especially as the former building administrator and me, to breathe a little sigh of relief to be like, oh my God, I don't think I can schedule all these courses, right? Because that's sort of what you look at when you see a grid like this until you get into the specifics and say, well, we're not really talking about tons and tons of time when we're doing vocab search, right? It's a shorter term intervention. And again, the goal of intervention is to get kids into it, to intervene and get them back to core as much as we can, right? So that is a process that, again, was a shift for a lot of the people I worked with because we were used to like the intervention paralysis in the sense of you just stayed there and it was like a life sentence, right? This changed the mindset for us to realize we were not just trying to intervene for years and years and years and years and still be in that same boat 5 years from now. But we were starting to become problem solvers to say, okay, we've done vocab surge level 1 or A, I believe.
A.
When we get to that end point, where is this student at? Have they made up gaps or has that intervention not worked for them? And this helped us kind of ground that work.
You'll also see there are multiple interventions that do the same thing here, right? So if you are familiar, you would know that the parallel universe and rewards plus secondary and mega words all kind of do about the same thing, right? And so this allowed us to think through what's our first line of defense with students? What are we going to try if that doesn't work, right? And how do we categorize that it doesn't work? We have to think about that, and that becomes the intervention grid part. But this allows us to really organize and say, it's not going to be up to each individual team to just say, we like this one, right? But we're really going to organize it. What order did we decide on? It was really at the discretion of the team based on a variety of decisions, right? At one school, they were like, we have a lot of buy-in around rewards. We're going to do that first. Great. At another school, parallel universe fit better into their schedule. Great. Then we're going to start with that. Really, it just allows you to think critically and systematize, like we said, how you're approaching this. There is no absolute right or wrong answer. But from a scheduling perspective, we do have schools that say, I need to offer rewards and vocab surge. Well, each of those can be done in a 20-minute span, right? If you break up the rewards lesson. And so we can combine those if we need to for one intervention period, right? And allow students some fluidity as to which section they go into or both. It really just gives you that control back as you think about what does this need to look like. You can build around.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why when you look at the sample that you have now in front of you, it would be very hard to just replicate this exact example in whatever school that you're working in. Obviously, these are some suggestions and some things that practitioners have found useful as they've described and mapped interventions, but it does look different in each school just based on capacity, student need. Another thing that helped when we would schedule interventions is we would look at their data, and you'll see examples of data that we would look at when you see the intervention grid. But we would look at that and see if we had cohorts that fit better into certain interventions, and that helped us prioritize. If we had kids, there were, 1 year we had tons of kids who had fluency needs. We needed to think about third quest groups more than we needed to think about Wilson, for example, in a particular year. So looking at your data of incoming students is important when you think about that scheduling component. So we've already sort of talked about the intervention grid development process. These are some questions that are guided for you along on the grid table that you see. And again, these questions help lead to a gap analysis. not only of what interventions we have and don't have, but what knowledge do we still need to understand. I always find when I do intervention grids that the idea of thinking about exit criteria sort of freaks people out because they're not used to thinking about how kids get out of something, right? We're very good at thinking about how we get into it, and progress monitoring tends to have, we have some semblance of that, but the idea of a kid has graduated from the program at this point is often a harder conversation that we wrap our heads around. And that was a big gap when we did this that surfaced for us that was a powerful thing to learn.
Can I just go back
Yeah.
really quickly? I want to point out one thing we talked about is if we can't figure out how we're going to progress monitor, enter and exit a student, it can't stay. So go back one more even.
Yep.
In this case, we had step up to writing, right? We really wanted to put it on the grid. We love step up to writing. We wanted to have it on there, but we really, even in talking with our patent colleagues on the literacy team in the West, we could not come up with what we wanted to be the entry and exit criteria that was appropriate for this district. Not that you couldn't create that, but we really couldn't think through how would we determine a student needed to be in a step up to writing intervention versus not. And so we ended up having to remove it from the grid. We still use it as a resource. It's still there. We can still offer it, in a variety of other ways, but we're not considering it something that we put students in. Because like Jacob said, we may enter a student into that and 6 years later, they're still doing step up to writing, right? Whether or not they need it, because we haven't set a criteria by which we're going to allow them to leave. And it's very, very hard for us as secondary teachers to think about students graduating when they still may struggle in some realm, right? They may still have some struggles in the LA class. They may still need some scaffolded supports as far as writing goes, but it still may not be appropriate to have them in like a tier 3 intervention.
Right.
All right.
And
sorry,
and graduating does not mean they no longer have support either, right? Like graduating is they go from one level of support perhaps to a less intense level. Do you have a question?
Sorry.
Oh,
My question was, what are your thoughts about using like a writing curriculum-based measurement, 3-minute timing sort of thing to track progress? At least I know it's just a small thing, and it doesn't capture certainly all of the things with writing, but.
sure.
Yeah, so we discussed that. We really thought about doing that. And then we decided that we were not going to do that for the student body. So how would we determine that a student entered? And so we said we would have to have that in place if we were going to go that route, either that or some sort of like smarter balanced rubric where we were screening all students. And again, it doesn't mean we'll never put it back on, but we don't have that data right now. So we said, it's got to go, right? So yes, I do think that would be the way to enter it in. And if you are already collecting that data, it would make sense for that to appear on your grid. But in this case, in the case of that school, it doesn't.
Which goes back, I think, to the idea that this is a multi-year process with a team of people. I know that was something we wanted to do at some point and looked at some automated tools that were coming out. Just became a thing of like we felt like we were treading water trying to get through some of these already. So we wanted to take a pause on that to be a little bit more systematic and thoughtful before integrating it in. So there is a blank template of this in the participant folder for you to use. It is adapted from the Midwest PBIS training materials. So like I said, some of these documents come from and are consistent with PBIS, which is awesome because that's the point of MTSS, right? Is that we're thinking about academics and behavior in similar parallel processes. And so this is the tool or template that you have concrete examples of, and I think you're getting a blank one right now. Yes, yes. So what you'll see here is there's a column for identifying the intervention, a description. The descriptions, as you'll see in the examples, vary. Sometimes they just describe what the intervention is. Another thing that some teams will do is they will put the logistics and scheduling components of the intervention in the description, right? So that it's clear to everybody. We've talked about if we're going to implement this, this is how we will do it. And again, that's an important team conversation to have. You'll see next there's school-wide entrance criteria, which again is based on various assessments. We also, as Laura said, want to make sure we have data to progress monitor in an intervention if we're going to follow through with it. And then exit criteria, again, as I talked about the graduation component and what happens next. In some of the cases, you'll see in the example, the exit criteria is that they just finished the program, right? Certain programs, there are no off-ramps. It is meant to be delivered from start to finish. Others, that is not the case, right? And so you'll have, I believe, 2 examples that are on your tables now that start with a skill grid and then go into an intervention grid. And I'll turn it over to Laura to talk about her experience with this.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. So we just screenshotted the first 2, and not
Yeah.
for any reason. They're just the first 2 on this school's grid, right? You have a full grid here to take a look at. But we talked about in this for this school, the students qualifying for the 3rd quest, that's a comprehensive intervention, would have it 5 days a week during tier 3 ELA or academic support. Those are the period names in that building, right? And we talked about, we added to this who would provide that instruction. Some schools add a logistics column where they say this can be taught by an ELA teacher, this has to be taught by a reading specialist, this can be taught by a special educator, right? And that is, of course, because certain programs require additional training or additional knowledge to instruct. Others are designed for teachers to pick up and use. Something like rewards is designed that you can pick it up and instruct in it because it's essentially a direct instruction program, right? It's scripted for you with very little training. And so we wanted to kind of make that clear in our description. We talked about the entry criteria. I want to be clear, we didn't make all of this up. In some cases, it's the program recommendation. Who is appropriate for this? Other times we looked at, okay, what is benchmark? According to how many students we have in this school who would fall into this, like, what is our criteria going to be? This is going to be a fluid document, not constantly changing, right? But if we are able to include more students at some point, we will do so. And then we thought about how we would progress monitor. Again, if we could not come up with a good, solid, valid progress monitoring process for each intervention, we had to exclude it from the grid. So sometimes folks will want to put in something like IXL, right? Which is probably a fine program. I haven't used it, but it is everything. And I don't quite know how you progress monitor it and on what skills, right? And so just kind of thinking about how you address something like that, that may be something that falls into a resource we use, but not an intervention we expect kids to make great growth in and come out. And so on here, we probably should have thought this through. These are both completion of the program. If you flip in your intervention grid, reading success, we said when they reached benchmark on the maze for 3 consecutive data points, that's for my school psych friends in the room, right? Right. But so we thought through, when were we going to say students completed this? And that again allows students to not get stuck for 6 years in the same process. We have some more complicated ones, right? Some more well-developed ones that say, if we are not making progress after X number of data points, then we will shift to a different intervention or more intensity or. So those items can be added in as criteria for entry. We may say that you only come into the parallel universe after successfully completing rewards or showing no growth in rewards, right? And we would have to define what does that mean. And so that's the way that we can kind of scaffold. Even though we have all these resources, we don't have to offer them all the time. We can systematically put kids through them to see what they respond to.
Right.
And we're at the 6-minute mark, which I know you know.
Yes, I'm aware. So the last thing as some takeaways. So like I said, you have blank examples or blank copies and then 2 examples of secondary intervention grids for you in your folder and in front of you. A couple takeaway things. While these documents are more robust and hopefully are not too overwhelming, but thinking about implementing them maybe, we really do encourage taking this one intervention at a time, right? I know I was always one that wanted to just jump in because I felt bad about not servicing all the kids in all the ways all the time, right? But one of the things I found having tried that out is that if I do try and do that as a school leader and as a school team, we were not ending up servicing any student very well because we hadn't systematically thought about how to implement our interventions. And so as you start this process, if you want to engage in it, I encourage you to do no more than 2 at a time to really map out well what the entrance exit, and progress monitoring will look like. And then often think about, as Laura said, the program recommendations, but also tie in data that comes from outside of the program as well when you're looking at that global progress to really ensure that our students are making progress, not just in program, but on global measures too, is important. And you'll see that reflected in some of the examples.
Very quickly, we said that your academic and or Patton and IU friends can talk to you about how to utilize this document, which is a behavior document that we have stolen. But really, we want to think about for students in the third quest, if we have 10 students participating, right, how many of those students are responding? And below, you'll find this in the actual documents, right, when you click on them, we have written what does it mean to respond, right? And that is a team decision to say, what does that mean, right? Is it the internal measures? Is it the external measures? Is it X amount of data points above the line, right? And so that becomes the conversation for the team to say, how will we know if students are making progress here? It helps us to think about, as Jacob said, not just throwing everyone into one and saying like, let's see what happens if they make progress. If they don't, how are we even going to know? And it really helps us to think about that idea that although we may not see giant PSSA growth the first year that we're working on something like multisyllabic word reading, it doesn't mean the intervention didn't work, right? We're talking about two different ideas here, two different measures. And so it helps us to focus in and think about what progress are we actually making.
Yeah. And so there are links in this slideshow, and our little references are.
We left 3 minutes for questions
Yes,
if they exist.
We're happy to take them.
We have one over here, Nicole.
I just have, I'm loud unless you need me to.
Wait, for the recording.
Oh.
Fair enough.
My question is related to like the list of interventional tiers. I'm coming from a special ed background. So my question is, how is it prevented from becoming the special ed curriculum or like a pull out, again, not a replacement class, but sometimes middle schools and secondary schools have a small group of students that participate in a direct instruction ELA class separate from the general education class. And a lot of times those teachers are like, well, what do we use? You say the general ELA curriculum, it doesn't make sense that they're being pulled out necessarily. So how is it balanced from it becoming like, you're going to do the third quest? That's it.
Yeah, so one thing the intervention grid does really well is it doesn't take other labels into account. So it's just, where does the kid fall on the data, right? And we were very intentional about that. Do you want to say something else?
Go ahead.
Like you were gonna say something. Okay, so we were really intentional about that and saying that students should get the intervention they need, not just by label, right? Not just because you're with this teacher. And it's why in some districts they have added the column, who can teach this? Because it could be that you as the special educator are offering one of these programs and you may have a couple of other kids in there, right? And in terms of thinking about it for an intervention, because it's not special ed time necessarily, right? We're just working on intervention in that case. Go ahead, Jacob.
I think adding on to that point, I think if that is a concern in your school, that is one important thing to do, is to elaborate on who actually can deliver this or should deliver it, and having people at the table as this is being designed that, again, have that gen ed and special ed mindset to this too, because that's where the creation of this can kind of parse out a lot of those things. And we want to set that up front, that this is not just like the special education grid, right? We want to emphasize to people that there can be students without IEPs in these interventions, again, as Laura said, if they qualify for it, right? And that's something, again, I would spell it out clearly in here, again, depending on how your school is set up, but I think that's a key thing to do, because that is a danger of happening for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, another question and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I am a certified ELA 10 and 12 teacher. I work in a really, really small school district, graduating class of maybe 30. So there aren't a lot of teachers in my school. So in addition to like full course load, I've also been asked to be responsible for all tier 3 students. And right now they're trying to find programs. I know they're looking at IXL, they're looking at iReady, and just looking at the grid model you have here has me thinking about how, oh, well, no wonder why the students showed no progress on our Acadians benchmarks at the end of the year, because it's impossible to do all interventions for one teacher for all the students. Even if the number of students I've been working with is 10, they all have different areas where they're falling short and are the areas that they need. And I just simply am not able to do all of that. So I guess, what do you think from your experience the recommendation would be for someone in my position in my school for steps moving forward?
Yeah, I think part of it is, so that is a challenge, and it's not a unique one, though. You may have a small population. We have plenty of schools that are like, I'm the one-stop shop, and everybody comes to me regardless of what this looks like. I get all the X's on the box, right? And so one of the things that we think about with that is having a schedule that is set up within that class to address either common areas of deficit, because usually at the secondary level, you can find some that are a little bit more common. And again, I always say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? If we do have common vocab deficits, trying to do something that's a little bit more unified around those particular skills that are common across the group that you have. Again, depending on the period, that can sometimes change, right? But having some kind of place to start and using this as a guide to say, here are the data we look at, and based on that data, here are the commonalities in that cohort, for example, that where I can have a starting point of intervening, knowing that if you had more people and more time, you could do more of these things, right? But that's kind of where I've seen those two worlds have to mesh.
I would add that you'll probably need to do some diagnostic testing beyond
Yeah.
what you have, right? To identify what are your major areas of need. And that is not spelled out in this grid, right? But we know that those things are essential in terms of thinking through. Our teams who are at this process are already engaging in diagnostic testing. And so thinking about, once we've screened, right, really honing in and saying it's not just all the students who are
Right.
in the red, so to speak, but really these are the students with these certain.
Right.
Yeah. Great question, though.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Laura and Jacob, and for all who attended. Thank you.